My name is Richard Coles. I'll be discussing the chemical control options for armored scales in Christmas trees. In the previous video, I introduced various species of armored scales that affect any of the conifers that are grown as Christmas trees. I will now go over in more detail chemical control strategies for armored scales. Those involve three strategies: use of dormant oil to suffocate scales, use of crawler sprays to intercept newly hatched scales as they move about on the plant surfaces, and systemic insecticides to kill scales by presenting insecticides from the interior of the plant tissues. Horticultural oils are generally applied while the plants are dormant. There are several challenges in making horticultural oil work for suffocating scales, one of which is that the scales are feeding on the undersides of the needles, and because oil acts through suffocation, complete spray coverage on the undersides of the needles is necessary to make oil work. Furthermore, armored scales live underneath the scale covers, and those scale covers can provide a reserve of air which can make it difficult to suffocate scales. Some of the scale crawlers will even settle under the mother scale's cover, which means that there can be multiple layers of scale covers, and of course those scales would be virtually impossible to contact with any spray material. Because Christmas trees are grown for their ornamental purposes and tend to have very dense foliage, this can make it nearly impossible to get good spray coverage when applying oil. Growers have attempted to use extension wands with upward pointed spray tips. However, the lower whorls of branches can intercept the spray, and so 2 or 3 whorls up you may not have good spray coverage. Another problem in using horticultural oil is its ability to injure plants. You should never apply horticultural oil to Douglas fir, as that will turn the trees yellow. About 5% of balsam fir may turn yellow. Even on true firs, bud break occurs at different times, and if oil is applied at late dormant time and some of the buds have started to break, you may end up with the phytotoxicity that's shown in this image, in which just the tips of the needles have turned yellow. Even though oil doesn't directly injure spruce, the oil can darken the color of needles that have waxy bloom on the surface, and so it's an easy way to turn a blue spruce dark green. You can use oil on young spruce and allow the new growth over the course of a couple years to allow the harvested tree to have its appropriate color. The second general chemical control strategy is to use a crawler spray, which targets the newly hatched nymphs as they move about on the plant surfaces. To know when to time these sprays, you need to install a crawler trap. To do this, you first have to remove the needles from about 1.5 inches length of branch from an infested shoot. Break off about 2 to 3 inches of black electrical tape, and then wrap the tape around that area that you stripped of needles very tightly. At first, you're wrapping it so that the adhesive is towards the twig, and then you double the tape back on itself so that the sticky part of the tape is going to be facing outwards. That will entrap the crawlers as they're moving on the branch. Now you notice the tape was a little bit too long. That's alright, because we can double over the end to make a handle that will make it easy to remove the tape from the twig. Lastly, don't forget to put flagging tape on the branch so that you can find the crawler tape later. On a weekly basis, go out and unwrap the crawler trap, take it back to where you can observe it with a high-quality hand lens to see the small yellow crawlers against the black background. I tested many insecticides in 2005 to see how well they would work as crawler sprays to control elongate and cryptomeria scale on Fraser firs. These materials were chosen because they had a reputation for having good activity against scales. They were applied either as one spray in the case of 2% oil or of the Onyx Pro product, or as 2 sprays applied the middle of June and at the end of the first week of July. In the middle column, you can see how many scales I counted later in the season out of 1,000 needles, so the highest population was found on the untreated check with an average of 8.2 scales per needle. In the next column on the right, you can see the percent reduction in the number of scales that resulted from these crawler sprays, ranging from 36% reduction with horticultural oil to 97% reduction with Flagship applied at a low dosage. Another important consideration is the overall cost per acre for each of these materials, ranging from $18 per acre for the Onyx Pro to $400 per acre in using the insect growth regulator Talus. When you take both the cost and the effectiveness into account, the winner appeared in this trial to be Onyx Pro, which has bifenthrin as the active ingredient. In only one application, we were able to obtain 94% reduction in the scale populations at a cost of about $18 per acre. We discovered very quickly that the use of bifenthrin to control armored scales requires nearly perfect spray coverage, which can be labor-intensive. When this insecticide is applied with a mist blower spraying from the perimeter, then the interior rows have inadequate spray coverage. Also, if a boom sprayer is used without air assist, then there isn't enough turbulence to allow spray droplets to intercept the bottom of the needles. Bifenthrin works as a contact insecticide. So when newly hatched crawlers are moving about on the plant surfaces, all they have to do is walk over the residues and they quickly will die. However, bifenthrin is a broad spectrum material, and so if you don't have good spray coverage and have most of the deposit on the upper side of the needles, then you'll mostly be killing scale predators rather than the scale crawlers. This is why you need to use equipment that will provide adequate spray deposition on the underside of needles, which includes a backpack mist blower sprayer, a hydraulic sprayer, or a narrow profile mist blower sprayer that can drive between rows of Christmas trees. This is an example of a very narrow sprayer that's probably usually used for spraying things like raspberry plantings. The sprayer is powerful enough that it pushes the droplets well into and penetrates the foliage of the Christmas trees. With spray turbulence, the droplets then can impact the undersurface of the needles. One disadvantage is that the sprayer only holds about 20 gallons of spray mixture. Onyx Pro, or bifenthrin, Safari, dimethoate, and many of the other insecticides used to target crawlers are not particularly IPM compatible because they kill off all the natural enemies of armored scales. In order to achieve integrated pest management, we need to find insecticides that can be applied in a manner in which we can kill the scales, but not their various predators or parasites. Systemic insecticides are materials that, when applied to one part of the plant, will move to other tissues within that plant. This characteristic makes systemic insecticides appropriate for targeting armored scales in a selective manner. For one thing, we can apply systemic insecticides to the base of the plant so that they'll be transported upward and reach all of the living tissue where scales may be feeding. Because they're on the inside of the plant and not on the outside of the foliage, predators and parasites can move around on the plant surfaces with impunity. Also, because if you apply them at the base of the plant, they'll move upward, they'll reach all the needles deep within the Christmas tree, which might be hard to achieve by applying a foliar spray from the outside. Safari had shown good promise with an earlier trial, and I knew it was systemic, so I decided to test it as a treatment, compare it with Onyx Pro as a foliar spray. The Safari was applied either to the soil in a banded application, or as a basal bark spray, in which the spray wetted the bark and then would allow the insecticide to be absorbed through the bark and translocated through the tree. The Safari was applied at the maximum labeled rate per acre, 1/2 of that rate, or 1/4 of the maximum labeled rate per acre. The result of this experiment was that we found that soil application of Safari was not an efficient way to get that insecticide into the tree. However, all 3 dosages of the basal bark spray worked very well for suppressing armored scale populations. In this data slide, I've averaged all 3 dosages, and they amounted to 83% reduction of the number of scales compared to the untreated check. A few of the reasons why Safari would not work well as a soil insecticide are that it is susceptible to light. So if we were to spray it on the surface of the soil and not incorporate it immediately, the insecticide would quickly be broken down and not be useful. Furthermore, if there were competing weeds growing near the base of the Christmas trees, they could pick up the insecticide rather than the tree. And finally, Safari has rather a high water solubility, and so by applying it to the base of the tree rather than to the soil, we are minimizing the risk of it moving through soil and leaching to groundwater. A further experiment demonstrated that an application either before bud break or up until mid-June provided the best effect from a basal bark spray of Safari to control armored scales. These needles are representative of the various spray timings. The needle at the top shows an untreated check. The next one down shows the pre-bud break. The third one down shows the application just after bud break. And the one on the bottom shows an application in mid-June. It's important to note that many of the scales on the needle at the bottom of the image are crawlers that started to feed and then died. The result from crawlers having started to feed was very subtle yellow spots on the upper side of the needles, resulting from the crawlers having injected some toxic saliva as they fed. Another experiment investigated the effectiveness of various dosages of Safari relative to different sized trees. There were several important observations and results from this experiment. First of all, small trees have many fewer scales. Of course, this makes sense because it takes time for scale populations to build up to large numbers, and of course you'd hope that the trees that are planted are free of scales to begin with. Secondly, it's much easier to kill scales on small trees. Remember that the insecticide is being diluted into all the living tissues in the above ground part of the tree, and so the relative concentration on a small tree is much higher than when you apply that same amount of insecticide to a large tree. And as a consequence, it means that large trees will require a higher quantity of insecticide to achieve good scale control. There are important practical implications from these observations, one of which it makes little sense to plant small trees among heavily infested large trees. Those small trees would then quickly become infested when crawlers blow over from those large trees. Rather, it makes more sense to try to clear-cut heavily infested blocks and then start with a clean slate when you replant. Also, because it's so much easier to control scales on smaller trees, you should try to have complete control of scales when the trees are about 4 feet tall, so that you don't have to attempt scale control as the trees get up to larger sizes. Based upon the results from the field experiments, appropriate dosages for control of Cryptomeria scale on Fraser firs amounts to about ½ pound of Safari insecticide for trees that are less than 5 feet tall, ¾ pound of product per acre for trees that are 6 feet tall, and it would take 1 pound or more per acre to control scale on trees that are 7 feet tall. Safari is a fairly expensive insecticide, so when you get up to saleable sized trees of 7 feet or greater, it may make more sense to do a foliar application with a product like Onyx Pro, which will kill not only the scale but also any other insects or spiders that customers may object to when they cut the tree and bring them into the house. One of the best methods to manage scales is to sell those trees when they become saleable size. In summary, if you're going to do basal bark sprays to control armored scales, you should apply the product just before or at bud break. Target 1 fluid ounce of spray per tree for a 6-foot tree. You can use slightly less for smaller trees and a little bit more for larger trees. Use a control flow valve to regulate the output of your sprayer so that you have a constant flow as you are spraying. Calibrate your sprayer before going out to the field in spraying the trees. You only need to spray the lower 10 inches of the trunk. To do this well, you may wish to do basal pruning, and also make sure that you have a herbicide strip. We use a flat fan nozzle spraying vertically so that we can apply the product just to the trunk. Typically, I suggest using 100 grams or 3.5 ounces of Safari product in a 3-gallon backpack sprayer, and with the advice of using 1 fluid ounce of spray per tree, that will amount to about 2/3 to 3/4 of a pound of product used per acre. Again, since the amount of product required to kill the scales depends upon the size of the tree, you can adjust the spray volume as you're spraying based upon the size of the tree to apply the correct dosage. A demonstration of the basal bark spray is in a supplemental video.